In the darkness before dawn on a cold morning in the Pacific theater of World War II, Japanese pilots climbed into their cockpits with absolute confidence burning in their hearts. They believed they owned the skies. They believed their training made them invincible. They believed that clouds were their friends and fog was their shield. But high above them and far below on distant hillsides, something was watching. Something they could not see. Something they did not believe could exist. It was an invisible eye made of radio waves, an electronic guardian that could see through storms and pierce through the thickest clouds, as if they were made of glass. The Japanese pilots laughed at rumors of this technology. They mocked the very idea that radio waves could spot an airplane. They called it Western fantasy and Allied propaganda. But their laughter would soon turn to horror as this invisible force tracked their every movement through weather that should have made them impossible to find. This is the story of how pride met science, how tradition crashed against innovation, and how the Japanese military's rejection of radar technology became one of the most costly mistakes in the history of modern warfare. The tale begins not with battles or explosions, but with invisible waves traveling through the air at the speed of light. It starts with scientists in laboratories far from any battlefield, men who dreamed of making the invisible visible, and who dared to believe that radio waves bouncing off metal could reveal secrets hidden in the sky. This is the complete journey of a technology that transformed warfare forever, and the tragic story of warriors who refused to believe in its power until it was far too late. From the earliest days of radar development to the catastrophic losses suffered by Japanese air forces, from the smug dismissals of Allied claims to the desperate scramble to catch up when the truth became undeniable, this is the entire story of how radar turned the tide of war and how Japanese pilots paid the ultimate price for their disbelief. Long before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, scientists across the world were experimenting with something that seemed like pure magic to anyone who witnessed it. In Britain, in America, and even in Germany, researchers discovered that radio waves could bounce off solid objects and return to their source, carrying information about distance and location. The principle was simple enough that a child could understand it. When you shout in a canyon, your voice echoes back to you, and the time it takes for that echo to return tells you how far away the canyon wall stands. Radio waves worked exactly the same way, except they traveled at the speed of light and could bounce off things far smaller than canyon walls. They could bounce off ships made of steel. They could bounce off airplanes made of aluminum. They could reveal the location of objects that human eyes could never see through darkness, through rain, through the thickest fog, and through clouds that seemed impenetrable. The British were the first to truly weaponize this technology because they faced a desperate threat that forced them to innovate or die. In the late 1930s, as Adolf Hitler's Germany grew stronger and more aggressive, British military planners looked across the English Channel with growing fear. They knew that German bombers could cross that narrow strip of water in minutes. They knew that by the time spotters on the coast saw enemy aircraft and telephoned warnings inland, those bombers would already be over London dropping their deadly cargo. The British needed a way to see farther, to detect threats earlier, to gain precious minutes that could mean the difference between life and death for thousands of civilians. A team of scientists led by Robert Watson Watt worked day and night to turn the theoretical possibility of radio detection into a practical military tool. They built tall towers along the British coast that sent out powerful pulses of radio energy. When those pulses struck aircraft, tiny amounts of energy bounced back, and sensitive receivers captured those echoes. Operators watching glowing screens could see dots of light representing aircraft positions, and they could track those dots as the planes moved across the sky. By the time war broke out in Europe in 1939, Britain had constructed a chain of radar stations along its southern and eastern coasts. This chain-home system became Britain's electronic shield. During the desperate summer of 1940, when German bombers filled the skies over England day after day in what became known as the Battle of Britain, Radar gave British fighter pilots an enormous advantage. Royal Air Force commanders knew exactly where German formations were forming up over France. They knew when those formations began crossing the channel. They knew how many aircraft were coming, what altitude they were flying, and what direction they were heading. British fighters could take off at exactly the right moment, climb to exactly the right altitude, and position themselves perfectly to intercept the incoming raiders. The Germans quickly realized the British had some kind of early warning system, but they never fully understood how effective it was or how completely it negated their numerical advantage. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, American scientists and engineers were developing their own radar systems. The United States military had watched Britain's success with great interest and had begun investing heavily in radio detection technology even before America entered the war. American researchers made rapid improvements to British designs, creating radar sets that were smaller, more powerful, and more reliable. They developed radar that could be mounted on ships to detect enemy vessels and submarines. They created radar that could be installed in aircraft to help bombers find their targets at night or through cloud cover. They even began working on radar small enough to fit in the nose of a fighter plane, giving individual pilots the ability to detect and track enemy aircraft in conditions where visual contact was impossible. The Americans poured resources into radar development with an enthusiasm that bordered on obsession, because they understood something fundamental about modern warfare. In the 20th century, information was power, and radar was an information weapon unlike anything that had ever existed before. To understand why Japanese military leaders dismissed radar technology so completely, we must first understand their entire philosophy of warfare and the culture that shaped their thinking. The Japanese military in the early 1940s was not just an armed force. It was the inheritor of centuries of samurai tradition, an institution steeped in beliefs about honor, courage, and the supremacy of human spirit over material things. Japanese officers believed deeply and truly that willpower could overcome any obstacle. They believed that superior training and dedication made their forces unbeatable. They believed that the fighting spirit of Japanese servicemen was a weapon more powerful than any machine or technology the West could produce. This was not just propaganda they told their enlisted men. This was what the officers themselves genuinely believed with an intensity that bordered on religious faith. Japanese pilot training was among the most rigorous in the world, and this fact gave Japanese aviators enormous confidence that sometimes crossed into arrogance. Young men who wanted to become naval aviators faced selection processes so harsh that only a tiny percentage made it through. Those who survived the initial screening then endured years of intensive training that pushed them to their absolute physical and mental limits. They learned to fly in all-weather conditions. They practiced navigation until they could find their way across vast stretches of empty ocean with minimal instruments. They rehearsed combat maneuvers until those movements became as natural as breathing. They competed constantly against each other, and only the very best earned the right to fly combat missions. By the time a Japanese naval aviator reached a carrier squadron, he had accumulated hundreds or even thousands of hours of flying time. He was a master of his aircraft and supremely confident in his abilities. When Japanese pilots heard that the Americans and British relied on electronic devices to find enemy planes, many of them felt something close to contempt. Real warriors used their eyes and their instincts, not machines. The Japanese military culture also placed enormous value on offensive action and aggressive tactics. Japanese doctrine emphasized attack, attack, and more attack. Defense was considered almost shameful, a sign of weakness and lack of fighting spirit. This offensive mindset shaped everything from grand strategy down to individual combat tactics. Japanese aircraft were designed with this philosophy in mind. The famous Zero fighter was fast, maneuverable, and had incredible range, but it achieved these qualities by sacrificing armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Japanese designers believed that the best defense was to shoot down the enemy before he could shoot you. So why waste weight on defensive features when that weight could be used for more fuel or ammunition? This same offensive mindset made Japanese commanders skeptical of radar, because radar was fundamentally a defensive technology. Radar helped you see the enemy coming so you could prepare defenses or scramble interceptors. But if your philosophy said that the best strategy was to attack first and attack relentlessly, then why did you need an electronic gadget to warn you about enemy movements? Better to focus your resources on building more aircraft and training more pilots who could carry the war to the enemy. There was also a deep current of technological skepticism running through parts of the Japanese military establishment, especially among older officers who had risen through the ranks during an earlier era. These men had fought in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905, a conflict that Japan won through superior morale and tactics despite facing a larger and theoretically more advanced enemy. They had seen Japanese soldiers charge Russian machine gun positions and prevail through sheer determination. They had witnessed Japanese naval forces defeat the Russian Baltic Fleet in a battle that shocked the world and announced Japan's arrival as a major military power. These victories reinforced a belief that Japanese spirit could overcome material disadvantages. When younger officers or technical specialists tried to explain that modern warfare was becoming increasingly dominated by technology, these older commanders often dismissed such talk as defeatist thinking or Western materialism. They pointed to Japan's past victories as proof that spirit mattered more than machines. They insisted that money spent on experimental gadgets would be better spent on more traditional weapons that had already proven their worth in battle. When Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, they achieved one of the most stunning tactical surprises in military history. The attack seemed to validate everything Japanese doctrine taught about the importance of offensive action and the power of highly trained aviators operating at the peak of their abilities. Wave after wave of Japanese bombers and torpedo planes swept over the American naval base, facing only disorganized resistance. American fighters barely got off the ground. American anti-aircraft fire was sporadic and largely ineffective. The Japanese pilots executed their attack plan with precision and withdrew with relatively light losses considering the scale of the operation. In a single morning, Japan had crippled the American Pacific Fleet and bought itself months or even years of freedom to operate across the vast Pacific Ocean with minimal interference. The months following Pearl Harbor seemed to confirm that Japan was unstoppable. Japanese forces swept south through the Philippines, through the Dutch East Indies, through Malaya and Singapore and Burma. Everywhere they attacked, Allied forces crumbled. The British fortress of Singapore, supposedly impregnable, fell in a matter of weeks. American and Filipino forces in the Philippines fought bravely but were overwhelmed. By the spring of 1942, Japan controlled a vast empire stretching from the borders of India to the islands of the Central Pacific, from the frozen wastes of the Aleutians to the tropical jungles of New Guinea. Japanese pilots dominated the skies over this enormous territory. Their Zeros outmaneuvered and outfought every Allied fighter they encountered. Japanese pilots accumulated victory after victory, and some became aces many times over, shooting down dozens of enemy aircraft. The combination of excellent aircraft, superb training, and superior tactics seemed invincible. During this period of spectacular Japanese success, intelligence reports about Allied radar technology began filtering back to Japanese headquarters from various sources. German allies shared some information about British radar capabilities. Japanese technical intelligence officers examined captured Allied equipment and documents. Some Japanese commanders stationed in occupied territories heard local resistance members or Allied prisoners mention radar, but these reports were largely ignored or dismissed as exaggerations. Japanese successes seemed to prove that radar, if it even worked as described, was not important enough to affect battlefield outcomes. If the Americans and British had this wonderful detection technology, why had they lost so many battles? Why had Singapore fallen? Why had American forces been driven from the Philippines? Clearly, these electronic systems were either propaganda designed to scare Japanese forces, or they were experimental toys that had no real battlefield value. Japanese pilots who heard about radar often laughed and joked that the Americans needed machines to do what Japanese eyes could do naturally. Why should Japan divert precious resources to develop something the enemy possessed, but which clearly did not help them win battles? There were a few voices in the Japanese military who understood that radar was genuinely important and that Japan was making a terrible mistake by not developing its own systems. A handful of scientists and engineers in Japanese universities and research laboratories had been experimenting with radio detection techniques since the late 1930s. They understood the basic principles and recognized the military potential. Some of these researchers tried desperately to get funding and support for radar development projects. They wrote reports explaining how radar could help defend the Japanese home islands against air attack. They argued that radar could make anti-aircraft guns more effective and give Japanese fighters advance warning of incoming bomber raids. They pleaded with military authorities to take this technology seriously before it was too late, but their warnings fell on deaf ears. Military budgets were devoted to building more ships, more aircraft, and more traditional weapons. Money for experimental electronics research was minimal. Officers who understood aviation and naval tactics held much more influence than scientists who understood radio waves. The few radar development projects that did receive funding were small-scale and low-priority efforts that never got the resources needed to produce effective military hardware. The Battle of Midway in June of 1942 became the turning point of the Pacific War, and while radar was not the decisive factor in that battle, the engagement demonstrated several truths that should have alarmed Japanese military planners. American intelligence broke Japanese naval codes and knew that a major operation was planned against Midway Island. American carriers positioned themselves northeast of Midway, waiting to ambush the Japanese fleet. When Japanese aircraft attacked Midway itself, American aircraft based on the island rose to meet them, and coordination between these defending forces was helped significantly by radar stations on Midway that detected the incoming Japanese strike force while it was still many miles away. The radar gave defenders precious minutes to scramble fighters and prepare anti-aircraft guns. While Japanese aircraft still hit Midway hard and inflicted significant damage, they faced better organized resistance than they had encountered at Pearl Harbor, and they suffered heavier losses as a result. The main carrier battle that followed proved catastrophic for Japan. American dive bombers caught 3 Japanese carriers with their decks full of armed and fueled aircraft preparing for a strike. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's finest carriers were burning wrecks that would sink before the day ended. A 4th carrier was destroyed later that afternoon. Japan lost not just 4 irreplaceable carriers, but also dozens of highly experienced pilots and hundreds of skilled aviation support personnel. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted in a single day. America, with its vast industrial capacity, could replace lost ships and aircraft relatively quickly. Japan, operating on a much smaller industrial base, could not. Even more critically, Japan could not replace the lost pilots. The ultra-demanding Japanese training system that produced such skilled aviators before the war was too slow and too selective to rapidly generate replacement pilots when combat losses mounted. Every experienced pilot lost was an irreplaceable asset, and Midway had killed many of the best. In the aftermath of Midway, Japanese commanders should have reassessed many of their assumptions, but institutional inertia and cultural factors made such reassessment difficult. Admitting that Japanese forces had been defeated, despite their superior spirit, would have contradicted fundamental beliefs about the nature of warfare. Instead, many officers explained Midway as a result of bad luck and unfortunate timing, rather than any systematic Allied advantage. They pointed out that American dive bombers had arrived at exactly the moment when Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, and they treated this timing as coincidence rather than the result of superior American intelligence and coordination. The role of radar in helping American forces maintain situational awareness and coordinate their scattered air groups was not fully appreciated by Japanese analysts. They saw technology as just one of many factors in a complex battle, not as a fundamental game changer that altered the nature of air and naval combat. As the war ground on through late 1942 and into 1943, the pace of air combat intensified. Japanese pilots found themselves in longer and more frequent battles against growing numbers of Allied aircraft. American factories were producing planes at a rate Japan could not match. British and American training programs were graduating thousands of new pilots, and while these Allied aviators were not as experienced or as skilled as Japanese veterans, they were competent enough and they had numbers on their side. Japanese squadrons that had once enjoyed air superiority now found themselves fighting desperately just to maintain parity. Combat attrition began eating away at Japan's core of veteran pilots. Some were killed in action. Others were wounded and sent home. Many who survived accumulated stress and fatigue from constant combat. The Japanese military culture made it difficult for pilots to admit exhaustion or ask for rest, so men kept flying missions even when they were mentally and physically drained. Mistakes happened. More pilots died. The casualty rate accelerated. The campaign for Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands became a grinding battle of attrition that devastated Japanese air power in the South Pacific. American forces invaded Guadalcanal in August of 1942, seizing a partially completed Japanese airfield and turning it into Henderson Field, an American airbase right in the middle of territory Japan considered firmly under its control. For the next 6 months, Japanese forces tried desperately to recapture the island. Night after night, Japanese warships bombarded Henderson Field. Day after day, Japanese bombers flew south from Rabaul to attack the airfield and the American positions around it. Japanese and American aircraft fought constantly over Guadalcanal and the surrounding waters. Ships clashed in night battles of terrible intensity. Thousands of soldiers died in jungle fighting. But despite all their efforts, despite appalling sacrifice, Japanese forces could not dislodge the Americans. Radar played an increasingly important role in the Guadalcanal campaign, and this should have sent alarm bells ringing throughout the Japanese military establishment. American coastwatchers hidden on islands throughout the Solomons radioed warnings when Japanese aircraft took off from Rabaul, giving Henderson Field advance notice of incoming raids. But even more critically, the Americans had installed radar sets on Guadalcanal itself. These radar units could detect Japanese aircraft while they were still far over the horizon. This early warning gave American fighters time to climb to altitude and position themselves advantageously before the Japanese arrived. Japanese pilots who had grown accustomed to achieving surprise found themselves instead being surprised. American fighters appeared out of nowhere, already at the right altitude and in the perfect position to attack. Japanese bomber formations that expected to catch the Americans on the ground instead ran into well-prepared defenses. Japanese losses mounted steadily. Japanese pilots began reporting strange experiences that they could not explain. They would approach Guadalcanal hidden in clouds, certain that they could not be seen, only to have American fighters emerge from different clouds and attack them as if they had known exactly where the Japanese formation was located. They would fly at night, using darkness as cover, only to be intercepted by American night fighters that somehow found them in the pitch black. They would vary their approach routes and altitudes, trying to achieve surprise, but American defenses always seemed ready. Some Japanese pilots began to wonder if there was truth to the rumors about Allied detection equipment. Others insisted that the Americans must have spies watching Japanese bases, Or perhaps the Americans had learned to break Japanese radio codes. Very few were willing to accept that radio waves bouncing off their aircraft were revealing their positions, because such an idea still seemed too much like science fiction. Meanwhile, American forces continued refining their radar-directed defense systems. Controllers on the ground watched their radar screens and used radio to direct fighters toward incoming Japanese formations. They could see exactly where the Japanese were, how high they were flying, how fast they were moving, and in what direction they were heading. They could guide American fighters to interception points with precision that seemed almost magical to the pilots receiving those instructions. An American fighter pilot might be flying blind in a cloud, unable to see anything beyond his wingtips, when his radio would crackle with instructions to turn to a specific heading and climb to a specific altitude. He would follow those instructions, emerge from the cloud, and find a Japanese bomber formation right in front of him. The Americans called this system ground-controlled intercept, and it was devastatingly effective. Japanese forces had no counter to it because they did not fully understand it, and they had not developed their own equivalent systems. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in early March of 1943 demonstrated just how deadly Allied technology had become when combined with proper tactics and intelligence. A Japanese convoy carrying troops and supplies to reinforce Japanese positions in New Guinea was spotted by Allied reconnaissance aircraft. The convoy included 8 transport ships and 8 destroyers. Allied commanders decided to attack the convoy using a combination of medium bombers and attack aircraft flying at low altitude. Normally, ships could defend themselves fairly effectively against air attack by maneuvering and using anti-aircraft fire. But the Allies used a new tactic called skip bombing, where aircraft flew extremely low over the water and released bombs that literally skipped across the ocean surface before striking ships at the waterline. More importantly, Allied aircraft used radar to find the convoy even though it was sailing under heavy cloud cover that should have hidden it from air attack. The Japanese convoy commander had deliberately chosen a route under bad weather, believing that clouds would protect his ships. He was catastrophically wrong. Allied aircraft found the convoy and attacked it mercilessly for 3 days. By the time the battle ended, all 8 transport ships and 4 destroyers had been sunk. Thousands of Japanese soldiers drowned. The survivors reached shore with no equipment, no supplies, and no will to fight. It was a complete disaster, and radar had played a crucial role in making it possible. As 1943 progressed, American forces began an island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, seizing key islands and bypassing others, always moving closer to Japan itself. Each amphibious invasion followed a similar pattern. American warships would bombard the target island for days or weeks, destroying defensive positions and softening up the Japanese garrison. American aircraft would strike the island constantly, and carrier-based fighters would establish air superiority over the invasion beaches. Then American Marines and Army troops would come ashore in amphibious vehicles, supported by naval gunfire and close air support. Japanese forces fought with incredible ferocity and almost never surrendered, but they were gradually overwhelmed by American firepower and numbers. Island after island fell. Japanese defensive perimeters shrank steadily. Throughout this campaign, radar gave American forces enormous advantages that Japanese commanders still did not fully appreciate or understand. American ships used surface search radar to detect Japanese vessels trying to approach under cover of darkness. American carriers used air search radar to detect Japanese aircraft launching strikes from distant bases. American fighters used radar warning systems that alerted them when Japanese aircraft were nearby, even if visual contact had not been established. American bomber formations used radar to navigate to distant targets and to find those targets even when they were hidden by clouds or darkness. Every aspect of American air and naval operations was enhanced by radar technology, and Japanese forces found themselves fighting an enemy who seemed to possess supernatural awareness of everything happening in the battlespace. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot of June 1944 stands as perhaps the most lopsided air battle in history, and demonstrated conclusively what happened when well-trained pilots using radar-equipped aircraft faced opponents who lacked equivalent technology. American forces invaded Saipan in the Mariana Islands, threatening a crucial link in Japan's defensive perimeter. The Japanese combined fleet responded with a major carrier operation intended to destroy the American invasion force. The Japanese admiral commanding the operation believed his carriers still held important advantages. His aircraft had longer range than American planes, meaning he could launch strikes from distances where American aircraft could not reach his ships. He had committed 9 aircraft carriers to the battle, including several large fleet carriers. He planned to use Japanese-controlled airfields in the Marianas to refuel and rearm his aircraft, effectively allowing them to shuttle back and forth between carriers and land bases while striking the American fleet. What the Japanese admiral did not know was that American radar technology had advanced enormously since the beginning of the war. American carriers now had sophisticated radar systems that could detect incoming aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. American fighter directors used this radar data to vector fighters toward threats with unprecedented precision. American fighters themselves carried radar warning receivers that helped them detect and evade Japanese aircraft. American ships bristled with radar-directed anti-aircraft guns that could track and engage targets with accuracy impossible just a year earlier. American submarines equipped with radar had already sunk several Japanese tankers that were supposed to refuel the Japanese carrier force, leaving Japanese aircraft with less fuel than their commanders expected. The Japanese planned on catching the Americans by surprise. Instead, the Americans knew exactly where the Japanese carriers were because submarines and search aircraft had detected them and were tracking their movements. When Japanese aircraft launched their strikes against the American fleet, they flew directly into a carefully prepared defense. American radar detected the incoming waves of Japanese aircraft when they were still nearly 100 miles away. American carriers launched every fighter they had, and radar controllers directed these fighters to intercept the Japanese formations long before they reached the American ships. Japanese pilots who had expected to face scattered resistance instead ran into massive formations of American fighters stacked at different altitudes and all vectored to the perfect intercept positions. The sky became filled with twisting, turning aircraft. Guns chattered. Planes fell burning into the sea. But the planes falling were almost all Japanese. American pilots shot down Japanese aircraft in numbers that seemed impossible. Wave after wave of Japanese attackers was shredded before reaching the American carriers. Those few Japanese aircraft that did get through the fighter screen then faced devastating fire from radar-directed anti-aircraft guns. By the end of the day, the Japanese had lost over 300 aircraft and many of their remaining experienced pilots. American losses were minimal. Pilots joked that the battle had been like a turkey shoot, and the name stuck. After the Marianas disaster, even the most stubborn Japanese officers could no longer deny that something fundamental had changed in the nature of air combat. The loss rates were simply too high and too consistent to be explained by bad luck or superior American pilot skill alone. Japanese aircraft were being intercepted too regularly. American defenses were too well coordinated. American fighters appeared in exactly the right places too often for it to be coincidence. Intelligence officers compiled reports from surviving pilots, and patterns emerged that could not be ignored. Pilots reported that Americans seemed able to detect Japanese aircraft in all weather conditions regardless of visibility. They reported that American fighters were being directed to intercept points by controllers who somehow knew exactly where Japanese formations were located. They reported that American night fighters were hunting in darkness with effectiveness that suggested they could see in conditions where sight should have been impossible. Finally, reluctantly, Japanese commanders began to accept that Allied radar technology was real, was effective, and was giving the enemy a decisive advantage. But accepting the reality of Allied radar superiority and doing something effective about it were two very different things. By mid-1944, Japan was losing the war on every front. American submarines were strangling Japanese supply lines, sinking merchant ships faster than Japan could replace them. American bombers were beginning to reach Japanese-held territories and were systematically destroying Japanese industry and infrastructure. The Japanese economy was under enormous strain, and resources that might have been devoted to developing advanced technology like radar were instead being poured into desperate attempts to build more conventional weapons. Japan did begin some crash programs to develop radar and radar countermeasures, but these efforts were too little and too late. Japanese scientists and engineers who had been warning about radar for years suddenly received urgent demands to produce working systems immediately, but technology development does not work that way. You cannot skip years of research and testing. You cannot create sophisticated electronics manufacturing capability overnight. Japan was years behind Britain and America in radar technology, and that gap was unbridgeable given the time and resources available. The Japanese military did what it could with the limited resources at hand. They began training pilots to fly at extremely low altitudes where radar had difficulty detecting them. They experimented with tactics designed to confuse radar by splitting formations and approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. They tried to jam Allied radar with primitive electronic warfare equipment. Some of these measures had modest success, but none of them addressed the fundamental problem that Japan simply did not have radar systems comparable to what the Allies possessed. Japanese fighters scrambled to intercept American bomber raids with no advance warning and had to rely on visual spotters who could only report what they could see with their eyes. By the time those spotters saw American bombers, those bombers were already over their targets. Japanese anti-aircraft guns fired without radar direction and hit far fewer targets than Allied guns that had radar to guide their fire. Japanese ships sailed without effective search radar and were repeatedly surprised by American vessels that detected them first and maneuvered to advantageous positions before opening fire. Perhaps the cruelest irony was that Japanese pilots who had once mocked the very idea of radar now found themselves wishing desperately that their own forces had such equipment. They flew missions knowing that American radar was tracking them from the moment they took off. They approached targets knowing that defenders had been alerted and were ready. They fought knowing that American fighters would appear in their worst possible moment because radar controllers were directing those fighters with precision. The psychological impact was enormous. Japanese pilots felt like they were fighting blind against an enemy who could see everything. They felt hunted, tracked, and targeted by invisible eyes that they could not counter or escape. Morale plummeted. Combat fatigue became epidemic. Even the bravest pilot can only endure so much stress before his effectiveness degrades. By late 1944, American B-29 Superfortress bombers began striking the Japanese home islands themselves. These massive aircraft flew from bases in China and later from captured islands in the Marianas, carrying tons of bombs across thousands of miles of ocean to hit factories, shipyards, and cities in Japan. The Japanese military scrambled to defend the homeland, but they faced enormous difficulties. The B-29s flew at altitudes above 25,000 feet, so high that many Japanese fighters struggled to reach them. The bombers were heavily armed and flew in large formations that provided mutual defensive fire. Most critically, Japanese defenses had almost no early warning of incoming raids. By the time spotters on the coast saw the bomber formations, those bombers were already deep into Japanese airspace. Japan did have some radar stations by this point in the war, but they were few in number, primitive in capability, and poorly integrated into the defensive system. Japanese radar operators might detect a large formation of aircraft approaching, but they had difficulty determining exact numbers, altitudes, or courses. They had no effective way to communicate that information quickly to fighter bases or anti-aircraft batteries. The coordination that the British had achieved during the Battle of Britain with their integrated radar network and command system was completely beyond Japanese capabilities in 1944. Japanese fighters took off and flew search patterns hoping to spot the American bombers visually. Sometimes they found the bomber streams and attacked bravely, but more often they missed the bombers entirely or arrived too late to prevent the attack. American bombers hit their targets, dropped their bombs, and flew home while Japanese fighters burned precious fuel searching empty skies. The firebombing campaign that began in March of 1945 brought unimaginable horror to Japanese cities. American bombers switched tactics from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks designed to burn down entire urban areas. Japanese cities, built largely of wood and paper, burned like kindling. Single raids killed tens of thousands of people. The fire bombings of Tokyo on the night of March 9th and 10th killed more people than the atomic bomb would later kill at Hiroshima. Japanese air defenses were almost completely ineffective against these raids. Fighters took off desperately trying to intercept the bombers, but in darkness and without radar to guide them, they rarely found their targets. Japanese pilots flew through smoke and flames searching for American aircraft, but the bombers came and went like ghosts, visible only when caught in searchlight beams, and anti-aircraft fire without radar direction rarely hit anything. Some Japanese pilots resorted to kamikaze tactics, deliberately crashing their aircraft into American bombers in suicide attacks. These tactics achieved occasional successes, but could not significantly affect the overall course of the bombing campaign. Japan was being burned to ashes from the air, and Japanese defenses were powerless to stop it. The lack of effective radar meant that Japan could not create the kind of integrated air defense system that might have made American raids significantly more costly. Every advantage lay with the attackers. American bombers had radar to help them navigate and find their targets. They had radar-equipped night fighters escorting them. They had reconnaissance aircraft with radar mapping Japanese defenses. They could choose when and where to strike, and Japanese defenders could only react after the bombers had already arrived. As the war entered its final months, Japanese military leaders finally understood with bitter clarity exactly how far behind their nation had fallen in electronic warfare technology. Captured American radar equipment was examined in detail by Japanese technicians who were astonished at its sophistication. American radar sets were smaller, more powerful, and more reliable than anything Japanese engineers had managed to produce. American systems used advanced components that Japanese industry could not manufacture. The transmitters were more efficient. The receivers were more sensitive. The displays were clearer and more informative. American radar could detect smaller targets at longer ranges and could provide more accurate position information. Everything about American radar technology was simply better, and the gap was so large that catching up would require not months, but years of intensive development effort. Japanese scientists who examined Allied technology also discovered that the Americans and British had not stood still, while Japan was ignoring radar. Allied technology had advanced tremendously during the war years. The British had developed airborne intercept radar that allowed night fighters to find and track enemy aircraft in complete darkness. The Americans had created radar-equipped gun sights that dramatically improved accuracy in air-to-air combat. Both nations had developed sophisticated radar jamming and deception techniques. They had created radar proximity fuses for anti-aircraft shells that caused the shells to explode when they came near an aircraft without needing a direct hit. Every aspect of Allied electronic warfare was years ahead of Japanese capabilities, and that technological advantage translated directly into combat effectiveness. The Japanese failure to develop radar was not simply an oversight or a single bad decision. It was the result of systemic problems within Japanese military culture and Japanese industry. The military's emphasis on offensive operations and fighting spirit had caused them to undervalue defensive technologies and the unglamorous work of detecting threats. The rigid hierarchy of the Japanese military made it difficult for junior officers and technical specialists to challenge the assumptions of senior commanders, even when those assumptions were clearly wrong. Japanese industry lacked the advanced electronics manufacturing capability that America and Britain had developed. Japanese universities produced excellent scientists and engineers, but those individuals worked with limited resources and received little support from military authorities who did not understand or value their work. The barriers to effective radar development were not just technical. They were cultural, institutional, and economic. Some Japanese officers tried to argue that their nation's failure with radar was understandable given Japan's more limited industrial base and resources. They pointed out that America was the richest and most technologically advanced nation on Earth, and that expecting Japan to match American technology was unrealistic. But this argument ignored the fact that Britain, fighting alone and nearly bankrupt, had still managed to develop effective radar systems before the war began. The British had understood that survival required innovation and had made radar a top priority. Japan, secure in its early victories and confident in its traditional military virtues, had not made that same commitment. Japanese leaders had chosen to invest in more carriers, more aircraft, more traditional weapons. They had dismissed radar as Western gadgetry. They had ignored warnings from their own scientists. Now, as Japan faced defeat, the consequences of those choices were devastating and undeniable. The last year of the war saw Japanese forces fighting with desperate courage, but rapidly dwindling effectiveness. The naval battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was the largest naval engagement in history and resulted in the destruction of Japanese naval power as an effective fighting force. Japanese carriers that had once dominated the Pacific were sunk or crippled. Japanese battleships, including the massive Yamato, fought bravely, but were overwhelmed by American numbers and technology. During these battles, American ships used radar to detect Japanese vessels at ranges where visual contact was impossible. They used radar to direct their gunfire at night, hitting targets they could not see. They used radar to coordinate complex maneuvers involving hundreds of ships spread across thousands of square miles of ocean. The Japanese had no equivalent capability and fought at an enormous disadvantage in every engagement. The kamikaze attacks that characterized the final year of the war were in many ways an admission that Japan had lost the technological war and was reduced to using the only weapon remaining, the willingness of its people to die. Thousands of young Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their aircraft into American ships, hoping that suicide attacks would inflict enough casualties to force America to negotiate a peace settlement short of unconditional surrender. Some kamikaze attacks succeeded in hitting their targets, and some American ships were damaged or sunk. But American radar dramatically reduced the effectiveness of these attacks. Radar allowed American ships to detect approaching kamikaze aircraft while they were still many miles away. Radar-directed fighter patrols could intercept and shoot down many kamikazes before they reached the fleet. Radar-guided anti-aircraft fire destroyed many more in the final moments of their attack runs. For every kamikaze that struck an American ship, many more were shot down short of their targets. Japan sacrificed thousands of pilots and aircraft for results that were tactically insignificant and strategically meaningless. The final months of the war brought new American technological horrors that Japanese defenses were powerless to stop. American submarines equipped with sophisticated radar hunted Japanese shipping with devastating effectiveness, sinking what little remained of Japan's merchant marine. American aircraft dropped magnetic and acoustic mines in Japanese waters using radar navigation to place the mines precisely where they would do the most damage. American warships bombarded Japanese coastal cities with impunity, using radar to navigate close to shore in darkness and to direct their gunfire at targets inland. Japan's economy collapsed. Imports of food and raw materials stopped. Factories shut down for lack of materials. Cities burned. Civilians starved. The military fought on because surrender was unthinkable, but everyone knew the war was lost. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 were delivered by aircraft that used radar navigation systems to find their targets with precision. The weapon itself was so destructive that the delivery method almost seemed irrelevant, but it is worth noting that the mission planners chose clear weather specifically because they wanted to be able to visually confirm they were hitting the correct targets. But the aircraft that flew those missions carried radar equipment that allowed them to navigate across the Pacific, find their targets even through partial cloud cover, and return safely to base. The bombs themselves represented the culmination of American technological and industrial power. They were weapons that Japan could never have built given its resources and industrial base. They ended the war in an instant of nuclear fire, and demonstrated conclusively that technology could trump courage, training, and fighting spirit. When the war ended with Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, military analysts from many nations began studying what had happened and why. The American victory was attributed to many factors including industrial capacity, resource availability, code breaking, and strategic decisions. But as analysts dug deeper into the campaigns and battles, the importance of radar became increasingly clear. Study after study concluded that radar had been one of the war's genuine game changers, a technology so significant that it fundamentally altered the nature of warfare. Countries around the world began massive investments in radar and electronics research. The lessons of the Pacific War were clear. Nations that failed to keep pace with technology would lose wars no matter how brave their soldiers or how strong their traditional military values. For Japan, the radar failure became a case study in institutional blindness and the dangers of allowing cultural assumptions to override empirical reality. Japanese military and political leaders engaged in painful self-examination after the war, trying to understand how their nation had fallen so far behind technologically and why warnings from scientists had been ignored. Multiple factors were identified. The military's dominance over civilian government had meant that military cultural values shaped national priorities in unhealthy ways. The emphasis on offensive operations and the dismissal of defensive technologies had left Japan vulnerable. The rigid hierarchy had prevented good information from flowing up the chain of command. The education system had emphasized rote learning and respect for authority over critical thinking and innovation. Japanese industry had focused on producing large numbers of adequate weapons, rather than smaller numbers of excellent weapons incorporating advanced technology. The human cost of Japan's radar failure is impossible to calculate precisely, but it was certainly measured in tens of thousands of lives. Japanese pilots died because they were intercepted by fighters guided by radar they could not evade. Japanese sailors drowned when their ships were torpedoed by submarines using radar to hunt in darkness. Japanese soldiers were killed by airstrikes they never saw coming because radar had detected their positions. Japanese civilians burned to death in their homes because Japanese air defenses without adequate radar could not stop American bombers. Every casualty had many causes, but radar's role in Allied victory meant that its absence in Japanese forces contributed to countless deaths that might have been prevented if Japan had taken the technology seriously from the beginning. Some historians argue that even if Japan had developed radar comparable to Allied systems, it would not have changed the war's outcome because the fundamental imbalance in resources and industrial capacity was too large to overcome. America simply had too much of everything: more factories, more oil, more steel, more trained workers, more technological expertise, more of everything needed to win a modern industrial war. This argument has merit, but it misses an important point. Japan's radar failure was not just about losing access to one specific technology. It was symptomatic of deeper problems in how Japanese institutions made decisions, valued information, and responded to changing circumstances. A nation that could ignore warnings about radar was a nation that would ignore warnings about other critical issues as well. The radar failure was both a cause of defeat and a symptom of the dysfunctions that made defeat inevitable. The story of Japanese pilots mocking radar until it killed them became a cautionary tale taught in military academies around the world for generations after the war ended. Officers studying military history learned about the danger of letting doctrine and tradition blind you to technological reality. They learned about the importance of listening to technical specialists, even when those specialists told you uncomfortable truths. They learned about the necessity of investing in defensive capabilities and intelligence systems, even when offensive weapons seemed more appealing. They learned that wars are won by the side that can adapt faster and learn more effectively, not necessarily by the side with the bravest soldiers or the strongest initial advantages. The radar story also influenced post-war Japanese culture in profound ways. Japan emerged from defeat determined never again to fall behind technologically. Japanese companies invested heavily in research and development. Japanese universities strengthened their science and engineering programs. The Japanese government supported technological innovation as a national priority. Within a few decades, Japan transformed itself into one of the world's leading technological powers, producing electronics, automobiles, and industrial equipment that were among the finest in the world. This transformation was driven partly by economic necessity, but also by a deep cultural memory of what had happened when Japan had dismissed technology as less important than spirit and tradition. The radar failure of World War II became a negative example that motivated positive change. In military circles, the Pacific War air campaigns influenced the development of integrated air defense systems throughout the Cold War and beyond. Every major nation built networks of radar stations feeding information to command centers that coordinated fighter intercepts and anti-aircraft systems. The techniques that the British pioneered during the Battle of Britain and that the Americans refined in the Pacific became the template for air defense worldwide. Modern air forces are completely dependent on radar and electronic systems. The idea of flying combat missions without radar would seem as absurd today as the idea of going into battle without weapons. The technology that Japanese pilots once mocked has become so fundamental to military operations that its absence is unthinkable. The broader lesson about respecting enemy capabilities and avoiding arrogance also resonated through military thinking in the decades after the war. American forces learned this lesson painfully in Vietnam when they discovered that North Vietnamese forces using relatively primitive weapons and tactics could still be devastatingly effective. Soviet forces learned it in Afghanistan when Afghan guerrillas using simple weapons and knowledge of terrain defeated a modern military. Military planners learned to avoid the assumption that technological superiority guaranteed victory and to respect opponents regardless of their apparent technological level. The Japanese had assumed that American reliance on technology indicated weakness and that American pilots who needed radar were inferior to Japanese pilots who relied on skill and instinct. This assumption proved catastrophically wrong, and the memory of that mistake influenced how military forces thought about technology and tactics for generations afterward. Behind the statistics and strategic analysis were thousands of individual Japanese pilots who flew into battle knowing they were at a desperate disadvantage, but who went anyway because duty demanded it. These men were not fools or fanatics. They were skilled aviators who loved flying and who served their country as best they could under impossible circumstances. They knew that American radar was tracking them. They knew that American fighters would be waiting. They knew that their chances of survival decreased with every mission, But they climbed into their cockpits anyway because that was what their training, their culture, and their sense of honor demanded. The waste of human potential represented by these deaths is staggering. Every pilot shot down was a young man who might have gone on to do great things in peacetime. Some might have become airline pilots, engineers, teachers, businessmen, or fathers who raised another generation. Instead, they died at 19 or 23 or 27, shot down by enemies they never saw, tracked by technology their leaders had dismissed as impossible or unimportant. Their courage deserved better than to be thrown away in a losing cause, but they were not given the choice. They served in a military system that valued obedience over initiative, and that sacrificed individuals for objectives that became increasingly meaningless as defeat loomed. After the war, some surviving Japanese pilots spoke about their experiences with a mixture of pride in what they had endured and anger at how they had been used. They expressed frustration that their superiors had ignored warnings about radar for so long and had allowed Japanese forces to fight at such terrible disadvantages. They talked about the comrades they had lost and the missions they had flown knowing they were essentially suicide runs. But they also remembered the beauty of flight, the intense bonds between squadron mates, and moments of achievement when they had managed to accomplish their missions despite all the obstacles. War had taken years of their lives and the lives of their friends, but they had survived, and they carried those memories forward into Japan's rebuilding and transformation. The American and Allied pilots who fought against the Japanese felt complex emotions about their opponents. They respected Japanese flying skill and courage even while they fought to kill them. After the war, some Allied pilots expressed regret that the war had required them to kill men who, in other circumstances, might have been friends or colleagues. They acknowledged that they had possessed technological advantages that made their jobs easier and Japanese pilots' jobs nearly impossible. Victory had required killing, and they had done what war demanded, but they took no pleasure in having killed brave men who were simply serving their country as they themselves were serving theirs. In the end, the story of Japanese pilots and radar is a tragedy of missed opportunities, institutional failure, and lives wasted by decisions made far from battlefields by men who never had to face the consequences of their choices. If Japanese military leaders had taken radar seriously in the late 1930s, when their own scientists first began experimenting with the technology, Japan might have entered the war with detection capabilities comparable to Britain's. If Japanese commanders had listened when intelligence reports in 1942 began indicating that Allied radar was more effective than expected, Japan might have accelerated its development programs early enough to make a difference. If Japanese officers had been willing to question their own assumptions about the superiority of spirit over technology, they might have recognized that modern war required both courage and capability, both fighting spirit and technological tools. But history does not offer do-overs or second chances. Japanese leaders made the decisions they made based on their beliefs, their culture, and the information they chose to accept or reject. Japanese pilots paid the price for those decisions with their lives. Japan as a nation paid the price with defeat, occupation, and the nuclear horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The lessons were learned, but only after unimaginable suffering. Technology cannot be wished away or dismissed as unimportant simply because it conflicts with traditional values. Enemies who possess technological advantages will use those advantages ruthlessly in war. Courage and skill matter enormously, but they are not substitutes for the tools needed to fight effectively on the modern battlefield. The pilots who mocked radar in the early years of the war were not stupid or ignorant. They were reacting to information they received through the lens of their training and cultural assumptions. They had been taught that Japanese virtues made them superior warriors. They had achieved stunning victories that seemed to confirm those teachings. When they heard about Allied radar, it seemed easier to dismiss it as propaganda than to accept that their enemies possessed a significant advantage. But reality does not care about what we choose to believe. Physics does not bend to cultural preferences. Radio waves bounce off aircraft whether pilots believe in radar or not. The Japanese pilots learned this truth the hard way, and many of them died in the learning. Today, the radar installations and control rooms of World War II are museum pieces, examples of technology that has been superseded many times over. Modern radar is so advanced that wartime systems seem almost quaint by comparison. Aircraft today are designed with stealth technology specifically to defeat radar. Electronic warfare has become a complex dance of detection, jamming, deception, and counter-deception that would have seemed like pure fantasy to wartime operators. But the fundamental principle remains the same. Invisible electromagnetic waves bounce off objects and return to their sources carrying information. The technology that Japanese pilots once mocked, and that killed so many of them, has evolved and grown more sophisticated, but it still does what it did in 1943 and 1944. It makes the invisible visible. It turns darkness into light. It gives those who possess it an enormous advantage over those who do not. The story of Japanese pilots and radar is ultimately about the collision between tradition and innovation, between cultural confidence and technological reality, between what we want to believe and what is actually true. It is a story that began with laughter and mockery and ended in defeat and ashes. It is a story of young men who flew into clouds believing those clouds would hide them, only to discover that invisible eyes were tracking them through every wisp of vapor and every bank of fog. It is a story of institutional failure so complete and so devastating that it became a case study in how not to make decisions about technology and warfare. It is a story whose lessons remain relevant decades later because the fundamental challenges it illustrates: how to assess new technologies, how to overcome institutional resistance to change, how to balance tradition with innovation, are challenges that every organization and every nation still faces today. The Japanese pilots who flew through the skies of the Pacific between 1941 and 1945 were some of the finest aviators in the world. Their training was superb. Their dedication was absolute. Their courage was beyond question. But courage alone could not defeat radar. Training alone could not overcome the ability of American controllers to see everything happening in the battle space and vector fighters to perfect intercept positions. Fighting spirit alone could not protect Japanese ships from submarines that hunted with radar in complete darkness. The Japanese military's belief that traditional warrior virtues were more important than modern technology was tested against reality and found catastrophically wanting. The pilots paid for their leaders' mistakes with their lives. Japan paid for those mistakes with defeat and devastation. The world learned lessons that shaped military development for generations to come. As we remember this story today, we should think not just about radar and aircraft in battles long past, but about the broader truth this story illustrates. Reality exists independent of our beliefs about it. Technology that we dismiss or mock can still kill us if our enemies take it seriously while we do not. Organizations that cannot adapt to changing circumstances will fail no matter how glorious their traditions or how confident their leaders. Information is valuable only if we listen to it and act on it appropriately. The Japanese pilots who once laughed at stories about Allied radar learned these truths too late to save themselves. But their story survives so that others might learn those same truths without paying the same terrible price. Their courage deserved better than to be wasted by leaders who could not see past their own assumptions. Their skill deserved better than to be negated by a technology their superiors refused to take seriously until far too late. Their sacrifice taught lessons that echo through time, and that remind us still that pride and tradition cannot shield us from reality, and that dismissing what we do not understand or do not want to believe is a path to disaster.